Hi everybody, I'm Zilla Blitz and welcome. Today we're going to take a first look at A Glorious Chance, designed by Gina Willis and published by Legion Wargames. Now this is a massive solitaire wargame covering the Battle of Lake Ontario in the War of 1812. You can play as either the British or the US side in this long, expansive game. There's a lot to look at. Let's jump right in and get started. Before we jump in and take a look at the box, let's do a little bit of an historical backdrop, just to kind of briefly set the scene for what we're going to be looking at. So this is really a campaign between the British and the US forces in the summer of 1813, June through September 1813, both sides vying for control of what we can see here on the box cover, Lake Ontario. For the British, control of Lake Ontario would give them access as an invasion route into the western part of the United States. For the US, likewise, they could invade Upper Canada if they controlled Lake Ontario. And thirdly, this was a vital supply causeway for the British for some of their outposts in North America. So this game simulates this 16-week campaign that happened in the summer of 1813 between these two forces vying for control of the lake. To get started, let's flip this over and take a look at the overall metrics of the game. We have number of players is 1. You can't play this 2 players. Having said that, it's important to note that there's really, in essence, 2 games in here using the same system. You can play either fully solitaire as the US forces or fully solitaire as the British forces. And there are actually separate maps for each of those 2 campaigns. Game complexity here is listed as medium to high. I've spent some time with the rules and they're somewhat extensive. I don't think they're necessarily that complex, but there's a good bit of heft to this one. I'm going to say like a 6 or a 6.5 out of 10 on a complexity scale. Solitaire suitability, high, of course. There is a kind of a dedicated, if you would, AI system that's interpreting kind of potential actions and things like that as the game goes along. It's very intricate, very well thought out. So this is definitely a 10 out of 10 in terms of solitaire suitability. With that in mind, let's now jump inside and start taking a look at what's inside the box. If we look inside, the first thing that we get is our documentation. And there are 2 rule books, one for the British and one for the US. And then we have a playbook, and we'll talk about this as we get there. The rule books are rather hefty, 44 pages, including the index on the back side. Each one is a full standalone rule book, even though there's a lot of overlap between the systems. So you're going to see, there's redundancy in between these 2 rule books. You're not playing 2 completely different games. A lot of it's similar, but there is enough discrepancies and varieties between the 2 systems that to make it easy to learn to play, they've created 2 full rule books for each side, which is really great to see because rather than having you say, if you're playing the Americans do this, or if you're playing the British do this, you just get to read and focus right on the rule book itself. Now, if we take a look at it, the 2 columns, rather large text, but again, there's a good bit of heft here. There's a number of kind of graphics and kind of artwork to kind of help, and kind of graphics and designs here to kind of explain some of the things that are going on. But there is quite a good bit of text here. Now, I have read through a good chunk of these, and so far I'm encouraged that the rules seem very clear, seem very well written. It looks like it's going to be a relatively straightforward procedure to learn. And I want to kind of talk a little bit about how the rule book is carved up, but before I do that, I want to kind of just talk a little bit about 2 major points to the game. The first up, if you as you start to look through this, you'll realize that this is very much a naval game. We got the ships on the cover. As the Navy, you're supporting your ground forces, but the ground battles are very abstract, they're very quick, and they don't happen very often. It's really the naval campaign for the control of Lake Ontario that this game focuses on. So with that, you've got 2 kind of larger parts of the campaign. One part of the game is where you're doing kind of the operational level stuff, deciding where to send your missions, deciding what kind of missions to engage in, deciding where you want to concentrate your forces, which ships you want to refill, which ships you want to refit, which ships you want to build, and things like that. So there's kind of an upper level, operational level game, really, if you would, that exists here. And then depending upon where you send out your ships and what kind of missions you're going on, there's a chance that they can generate encounters. Those encounters are kind of the second level of the game, which is really the tactical level of the game, and that's got a lot of heft and meat to it too. So both of these 2 portions of the game, kind of that operational level and the tactical combat level, really makes up kind of, I think, the heart of this game and what's involved here. The game, ultimately, victory conditions are decided by victory points, and this kind of gives you an idea on just the types of things that you can be doing and playing for as you're looking to gain kind of win this game and get control of it to be able to win the game. Lots of things for victory points: capturing enemy ships, destroying enemy ships. And it's important to note too that you've got a fully functional harbor, and you're going to be building and repairing and refitting and kind of taking ships out of action as the campaign goes along too. You've got the Niagara front, which is one part of Lake Ontario, is a contested land zone. And so how that land battle ends up can get you victory points one way or the other. Escorting convoys, conducting successful raids, controlling different lake zones. Kind of Lake Ontario is divided up into several zones. And if you gain control of those lake zones, that's going to get you victory points as well. And lastly, regarding kind of that shipbuilding and that harbor port, maintaining your construction delay at a level of 0 can get you victory points as well. So you're playing this game basically trying to maximize your victory points by doing these actions. So a lot of that operational level game, which is really covered kind of here in the sequence of play portion, is designed towards how and where you're going to put your kind of scarce and precious resources to accomplish that task. And if we kind of think about this rule book here too, it's really carved up into 3 chunks, if you would. The first part is your setup and kind of going over the cards and the units and things like that. That goes up to page 8. And then the sequence of play is extensive, and that goes all, and this is kind of that operational level part of the game, and it kind of walks you through step by step what to do. And that, I think, is the way to learn this game, is to kind of follow through from the beginning, set everything up, then start with the sequence of play and just use this as a guide until things become more automatic. And this takes you really all the way up to kind of page 20 here, where you get some side rules on ship damage, repair, deployable ships, and naval construction, and then missions, British ship upgrades as well. Then this part here, starting on page 25, which goes really all the way up through kind of page 40 something here. Yeah, 41 or so. This is all that tactical level combat game and how to execute that. A lot of thought, a lot of details gone into this, and it really looks like it's kind of a fabulous system for kind of, you know, an obscure conflict at a scale where your ground units really are kind of 800 to 1,000 men per counter ships or individual ships and things like that. Really looks like a lot of thought has been to put into a lot of the challenges that went into kind of successfully fighting this campaign. So there we have it. That's the US rulebook that we took a look at. The British rulebook, again, mirrors that. They are you know, different enough that they've created separate rulebooks, and there's a ton of redundancy. So it's not like you're learning 2 separate games, but by separating like that, it does kind of ease the confusion that might happen if you were trying to, if you had them all kind of compiled into one rule book. We do get a very nice playbook here. We get orders of battle, some player notes, designer notes. There are some optional advanced rules in here. And then, which is always appreciated, we get 3 extended examples of play. One for the US solo campaign, one for the British solo campaign, and then lastly, actually it's not really an extended kind of example of play, I think, but it gives you the lake combat learning scenario. So you can play this to really kind of focus in on how to learn that tactical level ship-to-ship combat system. So there is all of our documentation. So let's take a look at our counters. We have 2 counter sheets. These are 5/8 of an inch square, except for these double-sided ship counters that we have over here, both printed on both sides. And if we take a look at this first set here, we can see that most of these, if we look at them, they're actually markers to help both kind of manage the complexity and intricacies of tactical combat and things that happen on the operational map. So we've got, you know, escort mission is going on here. We've got possible encounter and encounter, depending upon where you put your resources in a particular turn and where the enemy puts theirs. It's going to lead to possible encounters and then encounters, and that could then in turn take you to something that happens on the tactical map. But we've got a lot of different counters here to help kind of execute gameplay. You know, close action markers over here, haze in terms of weather, convoy delayed, struck colors, a towing element that can be in there for the tactical display, where you can have, you know, a ship that's badly damaged get towed by a number of one of your other ships here as well. Lake control markers in here for -1 victory points in that case too. So again, printed on both sides to kind of help that. And again, most of those in there are markers. A relatively small number. We do have some troops down in here in the bottom right, but again, more markers: destroyed, sunk, last step markers, hits, again for the tactical one, mission markers to dictate what types of missions are going on. But the coolest ones here, I think, too, are definitely the ship counters. These are double width counters here. We can see there's a couple of types, besides there being kind of British and U.S. ships. The U.S. at the beginning of the campaign has a number of these very small, kind of pesky, mosquito-like schooners that can kind of fly all over the place, and they're somewhat expendable. And then the larger ships are the ones with these captain's wheels right here. And the ships, to kind of give a level of, kind of an example of level of detail here, if we look at the General Pike, that top left number is your long guns, the middle number is your carronades, the bottom left here is your close combat rating, and the top right is your defense strength. And we can also see that there are a couple of versions of some of these. So if we look at, for example, the Royal George here, we can see the 147 Royal George on the left, and then a 247 Royal George on the right with an increased defense strength of 4 instead of 2. So one of the things you can do in the game, which was part of the campaign, is upgrade and kind of build and improve upon your existing ships by putting on more guns, kind of building up the defenses of the ships. So one of the decisions you're making as you go through these is, do you want to use the ship as it is? Do you want to upgrade it? And there are step damages to ships as well too, so we can see reduced values on the other side here too. So that gives you a little bit of a sense of kind of how the counters are used and what's going on in some of the subtleties for the tactical combat situation as well. Let's take a look at our cards. We got a bunch of card decks here. The two larger ones are the target decks. And basically, each turn, this is kind of a rough overview of it, each turn has, you're going to calculate kind of the relative strength of the British compared to the US, and that's going to give you a number, either positive or negative, indicating which side has kind of got a larger presence in the Lake Ontario area for that particular 2-week segment of the campaign. And that's going to dictate how many of these targets can be established by your opponent. I think you can have as many as 8 in a particular turn. And then part of that operational level turn is executing these targets to find out what happens. So this means that British target lake is, the target is the South Lake area. Their mission is patrol. There's no secondary mission on it. And then this tells you the naval balance of power, depending on which way it is. If it is, you know, between -15 to 15, and that's calculated every one of those 2-week turns, you're going to be using this column. The number of troops that are available is here, and this tells you whether the British are going to deploy their naval forces to that particular zone in this turn. And the British deploy all of their ships when this happens. So if there's one troop available and the naval balance of power is -15 to 15, the British are going to deploy all their ships to this South Lake zone, and they're going to be executing a patrol mission there. So this kind of gives you an idea for how the British are going to be carrying out their missions and what's going on. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean something will happen to you. There's a number of other little processes that are going on, but all of these kind of AI cards, if you would, are essentially the same, kind of dictating where and when and what the British forces are going to be doing in their turns. There's all kinds of contingencies as well. So this is really kind of, if you would, the AI bot, the AI brain, if you would, for the British forces. Now, we also have a similar card deck for the US, and it's a little bit different because unlike the British, who deploy all of their ships in a particular region, it's very, very similar where we're looking at naval balance of power. It's going to give a region and then a kind of a mission. There's another patrol mission. Troops available dictates which ones get there. But for the US, we have a number, and this is a package number basically saying what is in the force that would get sent to this area, because the US have a lot of smaller ships, so they might send a couple of small ones. Could be all kinds of different force packages that get sent. But the pattern in the gameplay, again, is relatively is similar to the British kind of AI deck. It's going to giving you a location, a type of mission, what they're going to be doing, and then a force package if anything shows up there. And a lot of them are empty because you're going to be executing a number of these, and there's only going to be a couple places where the US are going to be kind of sending forces. Big hefty deck of these to kind of control the US brain if you're playing against them as the British. And then we also have a full-fledged tactics card system and event system in the game too. So defender tactics are here, attacker tactics are here, and then a rather large event deck here too. And this event deck is multi-purpose. There are really kind of 4 things going on this. This is kind of a naval display. They're kind of I believe these are the naval events, different things that can happen to your ships and stuff like that in blue. At the top right, this is flipped over when you're trying to determine if a possible encounter becomes an encounter. So we can see a telescope for some of them there, and then some of them have nothing. So a telescope, I think, there is a sighting in there that leads to a possible encounter. The empty one means that the encounter probably didn't happen. Then this middle bar along here refers to the wind gauge for tactical combat, and this is a negation factor for some of the tactics cards. So we'll talk about that as well. So you've got the kind of the encounter possibility, naval events, you've got the tactical kind of results that you're using it for, and then lastly there's a land event that can happen, and these occur at various times during the turn and things like that. So really there's 4 levels to these multi-purpose event cards that can go on. Separated ships, missed signal, convoy delay, commanding breeze, haze, minor damage, sickness. You get an idea. There's been a lot of thought and detail put into this system for these events. So it looks really fascinating. I can see, you know, talk about games telling stories, and I really feel like you could probably play this a lot of different times and have a lot of different things happen depending upon how these events influence the decisions that are made, how the AI acts, what kinds of things you're trying to emphasize. So in terms of replayability, I feel like the game is probably really high. Now, these are the attacker and defender tactic cards. These are used in of course, the tactical game. We have grapple, rate of fire, surprise, and there's various rules and conditions as to when and how you use these. We do see that symbol here. For example, rake has a star beside it, and that's where I think you compare that to the event bar here to see if it would be allowed or not. So if this were an event card you picked, that any star event is negated, so you could not play this tactic card if you had drawn this event card to negate it. So it just a lot of little touches in here for terms of how things play out. And I can say too, you know, although there's a lot going on here, it's not so much complex. It just feels like, you know, there's a good number of pieces to this game that you're going to be managing as you play through it. And so it's going to take a while to kind of familiarize yourself with those things. But I do like, again, how that rule book is written out and the sequence of play that you've got there to help guide you along. In addition to that, we have a set of player aids. There's a number of player aids that we'll be taking a look at here now. And these, I think, too, give an idea on how the game both is kind of guiding you into understanding its system and how to play it. So first up, we've got a British solo key map, and this kind of correlates with the US solo key map. So this basically you can look at to figure out and interpret how the maps are going to be working and what the different areas of the maps referring to, because we have naval zones, but we have a lot of supplementary tables and player aids that are scattered on the map as well. And this is basically your key to understanding that for both the British and the US maps. Then these are the setups, the guides for the setups and things like that, so you can look through the rule book and work through that rule book section and use this as kind of a guide to setting up the game. So those are 2 kind of initial, if you would, kind of player aids to help here. Now, when we looked at the US cards, we noticed that there was a package number in those the US target cards. So if there was naval strength was a certain amount and the ground forces were at a certain number, you might say deploy package number 4. And then package number 4, this is where you refer to figure out what the American AI force package would be. If you drew package number 4, 16 points of long gun strength, deploy as a single force, and then there's kind of a notation down there too. So this tells you how the US are going to be allocating their naval forces, because they don't put them all into one big bundle like the British do. So there is no equivalent player aid for the British game in this way. Then lastly, this is for the tactical campaign. This is the lake combat gunnery hit distribution. This is basically a chart that's used to figure out what ship gets hit in naval combat to aid with that execution on the tactical level. And here we can see kind of the abstract and simplified nature of the land battle table. You can influence the land battle table by the number of troops that are there and the strength, like the long gun strength of attacker ships. So if you've allocated ships to support that land battle, you're going to be shifting over here, giving you a better chance to get some results here in terms of kind of figuring out the land battle. This is if you're attacking on enemy home port or the Niagara front. So, and it gives you a little bit of a procedure through there. But this is relatively straightforward and simple. Again, the emphasis of the game is on the naval actions in here. Now, here we have the Lake Combat Sequences of Play. So this is a sequence of play guide for the tactical level combat game. And I will say, everything in the game is really large print. This is a little bit tiny. I can see it fine. I have pretty good eyes, so I can see it fine. It doesn't really create issues, but this is a small font. I mean, if you do have some challenging eyeball issues, this might be a little bit tricky and something that you might want to kind of enlarge or need a little bit of help to read. But other than that, I don't see any issues with any of the components there through there. This, however, is, I feel like this could have been double-sided, a little bit bigger perhaps, to make it a little bit more visually clear. Nothing on the other side here, but this again, you'd be working your way through as you're kind of going through the combat and tactical combat there. Lastly, these are two player aids that sit beside the maps here. These are the British and US home port displays, and this gives you an idea again on some of the things you're going to be doing in the game, because these are all of the different status levels for the ships that can be in your home port. So deployable, they're ready to go in action. You could be repairing ships. They could be in transit from someplace else. You could be building the ships in construction. You could be preparing them by making them ready. They could be out of play, or they could be in ordinary where they've been broken down and they're no longer part of the campaign. Your harbor can get isolated because you can do kind of, you can besiege, if you would, or blockade a harbor. So if it's isolated, then you've got deployable as at its temporary home port. You can be repairing things, in transit things, or to be taken out of service there too. So again, you do have blockades, or one of the tactics that can use in this. A lot of, again, intricacy between this naval operational level and a tactical combat level. So it looks like, you know, one of the questions I always have when I look at a solitaire game like this is, are you along for the ride, and to what degree is the player making interesting decisions? I can't know without playing it and things like that, but just looking at all the options that are available for you as the player, I feel like this is really a game that's going to give the player a ton of decisions and a ton of interesting decisions. So I'm very encouraged by kind of what I'd call the player agency in this. How much does the player impact what's happening? I feel like, based on what I can see so far, looking through the components, that there really is kind of a very high level of player agency in this. I mean, and this is a very creative and original game. I've not seen a game like this. In many ways, it does remind me a little bit on one of the other games that I really liked from Legion Wargames, which was Hill of Doves, a very unique and creative solo game that really takes kind of what would be a relatively small level or of an obscure conflict. And, you know, Hill of Doves is about the first Boer War, which is actually a really tiny one. Everybody knows the second Boer War, but the first Boer War was actually small and very short, and it's about that, and it really makes a fascinating game about some of the kind of the uniqueness of that conflict. This, I feel like, fits in that same category. You know, the Battle for Lake Ontario, the summer of 1813, but just throws the player into that world and the fascinating decisions that had to be made for those combatants on either side to be able to successfully kind of wage war up in Lake Ontario during the War of 1812. So lots of positive signs here. I'm very encouraged by what I've seen so far. But back to it, let's jump in and take a look at our last couple things here. This is the tactical combat display, relatively straightforward. You've got, I think this is gunnery, yeah, gunnery round one, and you're going to be basically putting ships in here, depending on where they sit, and then ships are going, you know, British ships are going over here, US ships are going over here. You can get into close action rounds and gunnery round two. And I haven't really learned the intricacies of the combat, but this is basically your tactical combat layout for the tactical level. And you can see again that a lot of the sailing and maneuvering is abstracted in terms of, you know, allocating hits and some of the decisions and tactics that go in here. So you've got basically a stacking system for the ships in here. They're going to face off and kind of fire at each other. So, and again, I haven't looked too much at the details of that, but there is quite a bit going on here. Now we do have, lastly and not least, we have two maps. Both of these maps are 22 by 34. One is the British map, as we can see here. One is the US map. Let's take a look at the British map and some of the pieces of this. They are nearly identical, so I'm just going to show one of these here. But it does have, and again, I would really call these more almost like maps and play systems, really, because we can see in the middle here, we've got Lake Ontario, and these are the zones that it's decided up into. So Kingston and Sackett's. Kingston Harbor is the British main harbor, and Sackett's Harbor is the US main harbor. Then we have North Lake, South Lake, and then over here, York and Niagara. And Niagara, again, is where this kind of contested land zone exists. But we have elements in here, again, you're going to be sending missions, so you're going to be moving kind of pieces and components on this map. But surrounding it really here are all the player aids that are really going to assist play, things you're going to be using at very high frequency. The bottom here is all the kind of the operations sequence of play. So this parallels with those rulebook from pages like 8 to 24. So you could be, I think I would recommend starting with the rulebook, and then as you start to get comfortable with the rulebook, you can probably go through this to remind you what to do, and then refer back to the rulebook when you need to figure it out. So I can imagine playing kind of a game or two to kind of learn the sequence of play and to kind of get a little bit fluid at the game. But again, it doesn't look, it looks like the assistance for playing in terms of the sequence of play aids, all the player aids that are here, the explanations, and just the way the game is presented. It really looks like this is the kind of game that you can set up and start to play. So you're going to be playing and learning at the same time. So you're not going to have to read like 30 pages of rules and then start to play. You literally can set it up. The first thing you do is you go through the first 8 pages of the rules and set the game up, and then immediately start playing with that sequence of play. So you're going to be playing to learn, which to me is a very enjoyable way to learn how to play a game. So I think this is going to be a really fun game, both to learn and to play, with the idea that, yeah, the first game or two might be kind of your learning games. Now, I did see somewhere too, to give you an idea on scope of the game, which is another thing I like about this game. It looks, I think the estimated play time was about 4 hours or so. And that feels about right. I mean, the turns have a lot of heft to them. There's 8 turns. Each one represents 2 weeks. You know, if you break down to that tactical combat, that's going to take a while to execute, although those probably won't happen all that often. Still, this operational level game and maneuver and the cat and mouse that goes on here for each turn, you know, it's you know, probably about 30 minutes per turn, and there's 8 of them as you go through. So it seems like when you get fluid with the system, that 4 hours is probably right. And I like that about a solitaire game. One of my favorite solitaire games was Save South Vietnam, which we played on the channel last year. I mean, that's a hefty 5-hour campaign, but it was so interesting. And so I like the idea when I see a solitaire game that's got a lot of meat and heft to it. It just really makes me feel like, oh wow, I really want to jump in and play. But again, along the top here, not to belabor too many things and kind of get lost off in the weeds here, this is that naval balance calculator to determine which way the Navy sides in a particular turn, which is going to dictate how many of those cards that get laid out. We have a convoy scatter table. Victory points track is up here. Ship victory points if destroyed and if captured and things like that. Different options you can do, land battle raids and stuff, patrols. We have a lake combat table over here. This is used as part of the tactical one. And then a convoy supply track here in terms of how you're doing supplying the convoys that are in the area. Available troops for British and US and all kinds of stuff. So a rather complex and hefty solitaire game, playable as both sides, either the British or the US. A Glorious Chance from Legion Wargames, designed by Gina Willis and produced, of course, by Legion Wargames. Now, I did see that there was a long time ago, almost looked like a very kind of print and play level game of this. So it looks to me like this was a game that Legion Wargames and Gina Willis has taken from an original state and really beefed up the production quality and made it into a full-fledged game. Thanks so much for watching. I'd be curious to hear your thoughts and happy to answer any questions that I could. Looks like this is a wonderful addition to solitaire gaming. At some point, I do hope to play it and kind of offer some thoughts on the game. But I'm really excited to kind of get this one in the house and kind of give it a shot. Thanks so much for watching, everybody, and have a great day.